Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis, and welcome to part 6 of our continuing series looking at Carl Wilson guest appearances on other people's records. We're up to the early 80s now, and next up is Another Page by Christopher Cross, released January 31st, 1983. It was, of course, Cross's follow-up to his big self-titled debut album released in 1979, which had gone all the way to number 6 on the strengths of hits like Ride Like the Wind and Sailing. Christopher Cross had written all the songs on his debut album. He clearly had a talent for well-constructed, catchy, adult-oriented pop rock and a beautiful, distinctive high voice that made him a standout. After his first album, I remember people, including myself, speculating that because there were no photos of him anywhere on the album, he might not be the most photogenic entertainer. In addition to its chart success, Christopher Cross's first album had won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Sailing had won the Grammy for Record of the Year and Song of the Year, and Christopher Cross had won Best New Artist. It was the first time any artist had won all 4 major categories in one year and wouldn't be repeated until Billie Eilish in 2020. Since then, he'd had a hit with Arthur's theme, Best That You Can Do, of course the main title from the big hit film Arthur starring Dudley Moore. The song was written by Christopher Cross with Peter Allen, Burt Bacharach, and Carol Bayer Sager. With that kind of pedigree, it should have been a hit, and it was. It spent 3 weeks at number 1 in the fall of 1981. By the early 80s, the track record was such on Best New Artist Grammy winners that it felt like it was almost expected that his second album would tank, ironically. Giving more weight to that theory was the fact that the second album didn't arrive until January 31st, 1983, more than 3 years after the first. Clearly, Cross and his team had spent the time going to great lengths to avoid that fate and to ensure that his second album would be every bit as solid as his first. You even get a very carefully stylist-managed photo of Cross on the inner sleeve. Of course, by this time, everybody had already seen him anyway, and his less-than-matinee idol look, I think, had become part of his charm. Among other things, Christopher Cross used a lot of big-name additional vocalists on the album, including Michael McDonald, Don Henley and J.D. Souther, Carla Bonoff, Art Garfunkel, and of course, Carl Wilson, who appears on the second track, Baby Says No. Carl and Christopher Cross had recently both contributed backing vocals to America's View from the Ground album. With the unspecified credits on that album's liner notes, it's impossible to say whether they appeared together on any of the tracks on that album. There are a lot of nice tracks on Another Page, and Baby Says No is one of the best. This is one track featuring Carl Wilson that really features Carl Wilson. You can clearly and distinctly hear him. After the first verse, there are a lot of oohs in the background of the remaining verses. I'm sure Carl is there, but this isn't where you really hear him. Where you can really hear Carl is echoing the line, I really think I got it bad this time, which is more or less the song's chorus, and in the middle section, gonna show 'em what love can do. It's the longest track on the album, running 6 minutes and 4 seconds with a long coda repeating, I've got it bad this time, with Cross and Carl both very prominent on the vocals. Maybe the worst thing about the song is the title. Baby Says No is the first line of the first verse. Anybody listening would assume that the title is something like I've Got It Bad, which maybe isn't a great title, but would allow people to identify the song. That minor quibble aside, the track is beautifully melodic, and you will definitely hear Carl contributing his unique voice. Another Page was far from being a flop, reaching number 11 on the charts and spawning 3 top 40 singles, the biggest of which, Think of Laura, went to number 9 for 2 weeks beginning February 4th, 1984. Some of that song's popularity seemed tied to its association with popular characters Luke and Laura on the ABC daytime soap opera General Hospital. Cross hadn't had that in mind when he wrote it, but ABC had started using it as the Luke and Laura love theme on the show. While Cross didn't have that use in mind, I wonder if Warner Brothers were thinking along those lines when they released it as a single. It's a decent song, but without that connection, it seems like a strange choice when there seem to be several stronger potential A-sides on the album, including Baby Says No. Baby Says No was released as the B-side of Deal 'Em Again in France, Germany, and Ireland. In any case, as things transpire, Think of Laura will end up being Cross's last top 40 hit, and Another Page his last top 40 album. That can probably be chalked up to changing styles and the grip of MTV as we got into the mid-'80s. I have to say, I hadn't listened to Christopher Cross in a long time, and I really enjoyed revisiting his records, putting this episode together. I'm a sucker for a good, catchy pop tune, and there are plenty there. To give you a reminder where Carl was in his career at this point, his second solo album, Youngblood, was released in February 1983, just a short time after Another Page hit the stores. Among the backing vocalists on Youngblood was Burton Cummings, the former frontman of the Guess Who. Recently on his Facebook page, Cummings posted this photo with the caption, "Way back in 1983, I sang some background harmonies on a solo Carl Wilson album called Youngblood. It was recorded at Cherokee Studios. I sang on Givin' You Up, Rockin' All Over the World, and Youngblood. One of the other harmony singers was Timothy B. Schmidt. Seen in this photo are standing Timothy B. Schmidt, yours truly, Carl Wilson. Seated at the control board is Jeff Skunk Baxter, who was, I believe, producing the album." Released about a year after Carl's album, Carl appeared on 2 tracks on Burton Cummings' 1984 album, Heart. And of all the records that Carl guested on, this one is probably the most difficult to find. It was only released in Burton Cummings' native Canada, and it doesn't seem to have been a very wide release even there. Both of the Carl tracks, Over You and the title track Heart, feature him on backing vocals along with Cummings and Timothy B. Schmidt. On this album, you can tell that, like so many of his contemporaries, Burton Cummings is struggling a little to sound modern, adopting 80s influences, especially on the keyboards and drums. Fortunately, he doesn't go overboard. It still sounds like Burton Cummings and not the Buggles. There's a contemporary reggae flavor to a lot of the tracks too, including Over You, but again, he doesn't overdo it. It's never a reggae pastiche like some of the Rolling Stones records. The influence is clear, but it still sounds like a Burton Cummings record. Like Youngblood, Heart was recorded at Cherokee Studios in Los Angeles. There's a core band performing on most of the tracks with a few other guest appearances, including Howard Kaylan and Mark Volman, Flo and Eddie, doing backing vocals on a couple of tracks, and Skunk Baxter and Billy Burnett contributing guitar to 1 track each. The final track on the album, Not Too Appealing, which is one of the highlights, features the same group as on the 2 Carl tracks, including Timothy B. Schmidt on backing vocals, but instead of Carl, songwriter Tom Kelly joins on the backing vocals. The title track, Heart, features some very prominent wordless backing vocals, vaguely reminding me of sections of Wishing You Were Here. I'm sure Carl is in there, but it's not likely that you'd spot him. Since it's a Burton Cummings song, it unsurprisingly has a catchy, solid melody. There are definitely some 80s sounds apparent, especially with the electric piano flourishes, but it's never overpowering. It's a strong track and one of the highlights of the album. Over You is reggae flavored like several other tracks on the album. It has a nice melody with some really nice chord changes. It features all the same personnel as Heart. I'm Over You background vocals are prominent in the middle section. The rest has a lead vocal only. Again, I'm sure Carl is in there, but I'd never know it without consulting the liner notes. It's another nice tune from Cummings, who must be one of the most consistently tuneful songwriters of the rock era. Not everything he writes is a classic, but I have the feeling that he has such a facility with melody that he could turn out catchy, entertaining tunes all day long. For me, Burton Cummings' voice sounds like an old friend, and as this album shows, even his obscure work is of a very high caliber and worth picking up if you happen to run across it. Be warned, though, before you pay a lot of money for a copy of Heart, that, unlike the Christopher Cross album, you won't find Carl's vocal jumping out at you on either of the tracks. He's undoubtedly there, but he is far from featured. Unfortunately, guest backing vocalist Timothy B. Schmidt's name is consistently misspelled on the album, adding an extra D before the T that doesn't belong there, as we can see when we come to the next Carl Wilson guest appearance on Playin' It Cool by Timothy B. Schmidt, released September 17th, 1984. This was Timothy B. Schmidt's first solo album. Schmidt, of course, had replaced Randy Meisner when he left Poco in 1969, and then replaced Randy Meisner when he left the Eagles in 1977. As we keep talking about, a lot of established artists were struggling to incorporate the 80s new wave big drums and electric keyboard sound into their work during this period. Few of them hit you over the head with the 80s sound the way Schmidt does on some of the tracks on this album. The overwhelming 80s influence isn't felt as strongly on some of the other tracks, which is a welcome break, but it also gives it a less cohesive feeling and the impression it was put together over many sessions over a number of years. Naturally, there are some good vocal performances by Schmidt. Carl provides backing vocal on the album's second track, Lonely Girl, along with Schmidt and the song's writer, Josh Leo. There are a lot of oohs and ahs and some more complex backing vocals. On a lot of those, it seems to be Schmidt's voice that's most prominent in the mix. You can definitely and clearly hear it's Carl singing She's Alone at several points, especially toward the end, and Oh Tonight at least one point. When I was reviewing the song for this episode, I knew there was some other song that it really reminded me of. It was one of those aggravating, I can almost think of it situations. I finally realized that what I was thinking of was Jackson Browne's Somebody's Baby from the Fast Times at Ridgemont High soundtrack. Coincidentally, that soundtrack also includes Timothy B. Schmidt's version of So Much in Love, which is also on Playin' It Cool. The Fast Times soundtrack had been released on July 30th, 1982, more than 2 years before Playin' It Cool. The fact that the song had already been out for a couple of years seems to confirm that this album was a long time in the making and maybe explain why it feels like a less than cohesive effort. It's not a bad album, but it is unmemorable, and the 80s trappings today make it feel more like a curio or a nostalgia item. For our purposes here, however, it is one more Carl Wilson backing vocal on which you can, at least briefly at several points, really hear Carl. Next up is David Lee Roth's solo debut 12-inch 4-track EP, Crazy from the Heat, released January 28, 1985. David Lee Roth, of course, was the frontman and lead singer for Van Halen, who were just coming off their biggest success, and I think I can safely say best work, with the 1984 album. In interviews, Roth has said he was on the beach in Puerto Vallarta listening to the Beach Boys. When California Girls came on, one of his bodyguards suggested that he cover it. Roth not only agreed, but the comment inspired the entire EP project. The song choice seems designed to present him in a different light from his work with Van Halen and maybe establish him more as an all-round entertainer. Roth says that they were just songs that he liked and only represented one guy's taste. I remember thinking at the time that the song selection, at least, was interestingly eclectic. Of the 4 songs, Easy Street was originally recorded by the Edgar Winter Group and released on their album Shock Treatment in 1974. Edgar Winter plays on this and 3 of the EP's 4 tracks, including California Girls. His saxophone is very prominent on Roth's recording of Easy Street. He warrants the one and only very special thanks in the liner notes. Just a Gigolo is based on Louis Prima's medley of Just a Gigolo, I Ain't Got Nobody from his 1956 album, The Wildest. As a second single from the EP, Roth's version will go to number 12 in the spring. Of course, there's California Girls, which we'll talk about in a moment, and from the 1966 Hums of the Lovin' Spoonful album, Coconut Grove, which is a song I always loved, and which I thought at the time was an unexpected and excellent choice to follow a cover of California Girls. David Lee Roth's version of California Girls wisely doesn't stray too much from the original. It's a little more stripped down, with synthesizers filling in for some of the more orchestral elements of the original and a little more guitar. Of course, Roth sings it his way with all the trademark ows. The backing vocal by Carl Wilson and Christopher Cross also follow the original pretty closely. Carl can be heard very clearly, especially in the ending coda's I Wish They All Could Be California vocals, and I'll bet this is one that Carl didn't need too many takes to nail. Released as a single, David Lee Roth's California Girls will hit number 3 on March 2nd, 1985, aided, of course, by a big high-concept video on MTV. That's the same peak position as the Beach Boys' original and makes this the second highest charting Carl Wilson guest appearance after Elton John's number 2, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, in 1974. Rumors that all was not well within Van Halen had been circulating for some time. It was easy to believe that dealing with David Lee Roth's over-the-top personality might have been challenging. On the other hand, it's doubtful that any member of the band was particularly delightful to spend time with at that point. David Lee Roth will officially leave Van Halen in August 1985. His first couple solo albums will go top 10 with a precipitous drop-off in the early 90s, probably due to more changes in the music industry, including the arrival of grunge. That's all we have time for. Next time, we'll wind up the 80s and make a start on the 90s. Hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to your comments. Please hit like if you don't mind. Subscribe if you haven't. Have a great week. Thanks for watching. Bye.